Hi, and welcome to Legally Insane News. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. Find and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell, and head over to legallyinsanefilms.com to listen to my other podcasts, to read my books and articles, to check out my photos from around the world, and to watch my documentary films. Again, that's legallyinsanefilms.com. This has been a huge week for gun critics and enthusiasts alike. Just yesterday, an enormous and resounding, I'll call it a win for gun legislation supporters on both sides of the gun debate, has passed the Senate floor, gone through Congress, and has been approved by Biden in what is being called a landslide bipartisan victory.
We're considering a bipartisan bill that will make our country safer without making it any less free. This is the sweet spot.
We'll talk about that one and discuss what the bill actually means in terms of the effects it will have on gun owners. I, for one, already like what I'm hearing about what they're saying about the common sense claims, but it is still very early. I've always been a fan of guns, but I've always also been a fan of making sure that people are sane enough to have them. And I know there's some debate in the gun community about this, so hear me out when I go over that story. But in any case, I have liked what I've heard about that. The NRA, I'll call him spokesperson, the lobbyist within the Senate, has already sort of given it the stamp of approval, as have, a couple handfuls of other, maybe even three handfuls, actually, of other Republicans on that side of the aisle. So we'll talk about that, and we'll be watching that as the weeks roll on. First up is the new gun bill to have passed the Senate floor and, as of this morning, was signed into law by President Biden.
For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Congress has passed a major gun safety bill with bipartisan support.
A good number of the voting Republicans have joined their Democratic neighbors across the aisle in Congress to pass a gun bill that is said to be the biggest in D.C. in more than 3 decades.
Just moments ago, the Senate successfully passed a major bipartisan gun safety bill for the first time in decades.
The first reports coming out of D.C. are that the gun bill addresses what Texas Senator John Cornyn calls common sense issues.
I think we've threaded the needle away in a way that protects the right of law-abiding citizens, but tries to get at the root of the problem that produced this shooting in Uvalde and has produced similar shooting elsewhere, and I think ultimately will save lives, and to me that's the ultimate test.
But what's common sense for most people these days is largely what's being fed to them as common sense by the media. So I'll be taking a look at the bill itself and seeing if I can make any sense of that in a later edition of This Week in Guns. I'm sure we'll have plenty to say by next week. My first reaction, kind of like my knee-jerk reaction right out of the gate, however, from the initial reports coming out, are that the red flag laws are actually being supported by this bill. And I was kind of surprised to see that with everything else that I'll call it was supported, passed, etc. These are troubling laws. If you don't know about these, okay, these are troubling laws that basically translate to someone being able to call in the name of any gun owner to police, meaning they can just call in, say, John so-and-so threatened me with his gun. He brandished in front of me yesterday. The police then can show up at their house and take that person's guns. They can do this without warrants, without any adjudication by the courts, and therefore, of course, without due process. This has been the biggest problem that earlier bills have been shut down for in the first place. This is, of course, an unconstitutional law, if I've ever heard one. Of course, I understand the argument on the other side. We certainly don't need to be losing domestic partners, to situations of violence. But how those bills in the past have been coined, been written, been pushed forward have not been equitable for both sides of that particular debate. And I think what they're saying is that they finally found a bill that does kind of answer both sides of that. We'll see. Again, I'll take a look at it.
The compromise package does not include all the broad measures Democrats sought, but it does include a variety of significant steps, from increased funding for mental health to more comprehensive background checks for 18 to 21-year-olds.
The next is heightened background checks for mental illness. I've always been in support of this. I was involved in a school shooting. I feel very strongly that the individual who killed the people in my school was suffering a mental illness at the time. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can enact violence in a mass shooter type scenario, especially against kids, unless you have something wrong with you mentally. I think that should be sort of a de facto understanding. But in any case, it will be difficult to know right off the bat what the government actually defines as a mental illness that might prohibit gun ownership in the sort of the wake of that decision. I'm sure a lot of it will be hashed out, but we'll see what happens there. As someone with a learning disorder, as I am, this is a little bit troubling that I could be lumped into the same pile with people who have mental disorders. Obviously, a learning disorder is not a mental disorder, but I'm hopeful that this doesn't include me and others like me. I guess, again, we'll just have to see how that goes. So I'll be watching that one very closely, that part of it. The initiative also cites funding approvals for communities and schools to better protect themselves. So long as it doesn't mean a militant presence or like a militarized police force in these areas, I'd say that's a good idea. We'll see what that looks like. I think if the freedom exists in this bill to let individual communities and states decide for themselves what they actually want in terms of seeing protection and what that has the look and feel of in their individual communities, I'm all in favor of it, because what will work in communities in California will not work in communities in Chicago, say. And we need to be very particular on how we implement letting the government into our communities even more than they currently are. Just my take, my opinion. In fact, to further that opinion a little bit, I am in favor of like an armed neighborhood watch or an organization of armed community members. It's, separate from the police, or maybe like including off-duty police or whatever, like anything to bridge the community, I think would work there. And even having community members do armed volunteer watches in their children's schools with body armor and radio dispatches to connect them to law enforcement and school administration. I mean, those are very common sense answers to lightening the load on police and drawing stronger connections with the communities and certainly the schools, which have literally been under fire recently. I actually did a podcast about this. It's called How to Solve School Shootings Like Uvalde. And if you haven't heard that one, check it out. I kind of detail that theoretical initiative in greater detail there. While I'm certain that funding is not appropriate in the bill for the kind of thing that I'm suggesting, I'm more sure that it likely translates to just, stationing armed, uniformed people at these locations. But again, we haven't seen this in action, so we'll see what that looks like. Then, of course, there's the increase in scrutiny for purchasing guns by age. The various researching agencies on gun violence have apparently found out that younger citizens are more likely to be involved in active shooter scenarios. I cannot talk today for some reason. And that part of the bill will hopefully address that concern. I don't know the research. I haven't looked at that particular part of the research in general. As the bill grows and time moves on, I may be including more of that in following weeks. But I suppose all of that, how it affects gun buyers, and of course the statistics on how this part of the bill potentially changes those statistics, remains to be seen. So I'll just keep an eye on it as it evolves. I hate that I can only report that much, but the bill is pretty new. Perhaps the most contentious part of the bill that nearly shut it down actually was the language that it included about a, quote, boyfriend loophole.
And it includes one key provision that almost tanked the whole deal.
Operating under the boyfriend loophole.
The so-called boyfriend loophole continues to be a challenge.
We're going to close the boyfriend loophole.
Leaving aside for the moment that calling it a, quote, boyfriend loophole, which assumes that men are the only abusers in domestic relationships, earlier attempts to thwart this so-called loophole were all shut down because they bypassed another right that sets the American system of governance apart. And when I say that, I mean it sets it apart from other countries where basically anyone at any time can make any claim about anybody else without a shred of evidence and see that person thrown in jail, or in the case that Democrats want to see happen, have their gun rights taken away. And I mean permanently. They are going after your rights. They've even said it.
We're going to make sure that every domestic abuser, whether it be a spouse or a boyfriend, has their guns taken away.
And see how they're saying that there, spouse or boyfriend? They want to permanently ban anyone's rights to possess a firearm. And again, when I say anyone's in this particular case of this particular quote unquote boyfriend loophole, it's not called a girlfriend loophole, right? It's not called a domestic partner loophole, but rather it's called a boyfriend loophole. So they are literally targeting men in this quote unquote loophole.
People who beat up their girlfriends have lobbyists fighting to preserve their ability to buy guns.
The research is clear that both wives and girlfriends kill their significant others in huge numbers across the U.S., and anybody who debates that is flat out lying to you. I have plenty of research on the article for this to back that claim up. In fact, according to the Office of Justice Programs within the Department of Justice, for every 100 men who killed their wives in the United States, 75 women killed their husbands. Okay. This is a staggering statistic when you consider the fact that the left would have you believe that men kill women at a rate of 9-1. And by the way, most left-leaning news outlets, when they're talking about this data, they're citing a very popular HuffPost article from 2016 that skewed the data from a study by the Violence Policy Center, stating, quote, "The report found that in 2014, over 1,600 women were killed by men. The most common weapon used was a gun. During the same period of time, there were only 15 instances of women using firearms to kill a man in self-defense." Let that sink in. 15. Okay, so I'm just going to go back over this in case you missed it there. They plucked one fact that men had killed women with guns. Then they plucked another fact that women used guns to defend themselves. Then they put these facts together in a sentence that would have you believe that there were only 15 instances that in the entire year of 2014, women used guns the same way men did. I'll read that again and keep this in mind as I'm saying that. The report found that in 2014, over 1,600 women were killed by men. The most common weapon used was a gun. During that same period of time, there were only 15 instances of women using firearms to kill a man in self-defense. Let that sink in. 15. They're not comparing two equal data sets. If they were, they'd be citing the number of times that both men and women used a gun to defend themselves. Or they'd be citing an instance where both men and women used a gun to offensively kill their partners. Instead, they're citing the number of times that a woman defended herself against any attacker, right? Any attack, not just the husband, but any attacker, with the number of times that any man used a gun to kill a woman. Again, not even citing the wife. This is how people skew statistics, all right? They left out that finicky little detail about how often women kill men outside of self-defense. That number is actually quite different. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that that was not what HuffPost wanted to say in that article, so they just sort of conveniently left that detail out, all while sort of claiming that, oh, we are telling the truth. Well, yeah, you're telling one truth that was found in there, one statistic. But you're not telling the whole thing. They're not really willing to say that. But I am happy to share that with you. And here it is. According to a study that I found, not on the internet, but which I had to go into my paid subscription to LexisNexis and find, and which I will cite in the article for this podcast, the DOJ's Office of Justice Programs, report number November Charlie Juliet 175688 from 1999, found that between 1976 and 1997, which is a 20-year period, women killed more than 60,000 men. That's 3,000 men a year and a little over 8 per day on average. Now, if the HuffPost reported that, right, in the lead up to their 2017 data, might have given a different impression. Perhaps even worse than that was that the FBI investigation from 2016 that studied 10,000 familial murders, in other words, like murders within the family, that study found that 41% of those charged were women. That's close to half. And that's just charged with murder, right? That's not findings outside of defensible activities, right? Per the incident. Now, I can cite these statistics all day long. I can keep going down this list that confound the leftist agenda on gun rights. In fact, I'm a journalism professor, so that's kind of my job. I teach, aspiring researchers all over the world how to read into the agenda of news and find the right information from the most reliable resources to combat that information. It is wild once I remember back to even my earliest journalism years. In taking journalism classes, by the way, you're going to be taking them from liberal campuses. Journalism is almost innumerably more vast in its leaning to the left. It's another conversation for another day, but that's kind of where you're going to learn from. Unfortunately, though, for them, that when they teach you how to find the right statistics, they also teach you how to find the right statistics that don't necessarily work to push forward their agenda. So in any case, that's what I've decided to do. I take that, world of knowledge and put it into a podcast that you're listening to right now in hopes that we can at least balance that out. I'm really not even trying to push an agenda. Like, I'm really just trying to defend constitutional rights. That's really all I'm doing. And when those constitutional rights are challenged by, I'll call them institutions of media, like the media agencies of the country, that's a problem for me. So yeah, I'm going to fight back. And I know how. So in other words, you're being lied to by the woke media monster with a very limited scope of understanding for the ability of its audience to think critically and for themselves. And of course, I'm talking about you right now. They are banking on the idea that you will remain ignorant so long as they tell you what to believe. But that's a podcast for another day. To bring it back to the discussion at hand, obviously, there was enough pushback from Republicans that the various powers that be agreed that the previous versions of the boyfriend loophole violated a number of rights, including the right to due process. That and the red flag gun laws, which are simply boyfriend loopholes that extend to non-domestic partners, will be an item many Second Amendment supporters will want to watch for in the future. With that said, however, on the very same day that the gun bill was pushed forward, a long-standing unconstitutional gun law that's kept New York citizens unarmed in the face of steadily rising crime in recent years has also been dashed. It's a pretty big win, actually, for gun right advocates in New York and all over the New England states as well. In fact, I'm willing to bet all the way down to Pennsylvania. There's frequent travelers that are affected by this. The gun law that's allowed many criminals to get away with carrying handguns and also making ghost guns in New York, but which has also kept law-abiding citizens living in fear of those lawbreakers, has finally been shot down in a Supreme Court ruling this past Tuesday. Biden shot back pretty quickly, enforcing his stance on the Second Amendment, but he made no comment on the long-standing effects it had on citizens living and traveling in the American Northeast. Even for anyone driving through New York with guns in their vehicles or on their person, criminal charges could be filed against them, and they could have their property seized. And since New York covers the entire landlocked access from every state in New England to every other part of the country, that means every single driver who happens to transport their guns between the two regions of the country are hindered under these laws. And that's a big number if you don't know. I've traveled through there several times, and knowing the laws, I'm pretty actually concerned about, or at least I was. We'll see how it goes from here forward, but there were a point of concern at certain times. According to Hudson Valley criminal law, it is illegal for anyone without a valid New York gun permit to transport a handgun, whether loaded or unloaded. And that's a direct quote. And of course, according to New York's lofty restrictions placed on who and how gun permits are applied for, you're not only required to be a resident of New York to get a gun permit, you're also required to have or plan to open a business for which the gun permit application is being submitted. That's just, if that's not a setup, I don't know what is. That's so anti-constitutional. It's kind of hard to say that in one breath and not just be aghast by it. Yeah, in any case, not just New Yorkers obviously are affected by that and have suffered through that era of staunch anti-constitutional, anti-gun legislation. The long outmoded law that the state government in New York has been relying on for violating the Constitution's view of gun ownership for more than 100 years is a 1913 ruling that required New York citizens to show, quote, proper cause in order to get a license to carry a gun in public spaces. 1913. That's more than 100 years they've been violating people's constitutional rights, and the Supreme Court just confirmed that. Since then, the requirements have steadily grown more robust, not easier, by the way, as the years have passed. At this point, according to New York, in other words, ny.gov, like newyork.gov's permit requirements, the list of requirements for that gun permit are as follows. First, you must be a New York State resident. You must be 21 years of age. You must have no prior felony or quote-unquote serious offense convictions, which can and undoubtedly has been used to avoid approving permits in the past. You must be of good moral character, which is also a matter of opinion. You must have a legal and recognized reason for wanting to possess or carry a firearm, and you must be ready to open the business for which the license is being applied. Several of those just stumble all over each other and are clearly subjective per the, county in which you apply. I'm sure that's just wreaked havoc for gun owners there. Nevertheless, these requirements are about to change since the Supreme Court's decision was a 5-4 vote in the state legislature that the right to bear arms applied to New York under the 14th Amendment. And for those of you wondering, the very first section of the 14th Amendment states, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And it is for this exact language that I think the New York Supreme Court's decision will be used as precedent in other states, or at least that's the hope. But reeling it in for the purposes of the gun bill discussion, this new revelation for New York, which will almost assuredly have an impact on other states, is almost as momentous as the newest gun bill to be approved this morning. The first major Second Amendment decision from SCOTUS in more than a decade. Even so, the New York Post reports that the Supreme Court's decision on the matter is, quote, disappointing. Quoting Mayor Eric Adams, who's already fretting about how to ensure the city won't become, as he puts it, the Wild West, and promising to work to, quote, limit the risks that this decision will create. I'm not sure where he's going with that, since New York's got some of the harshest gun laws next to California, and yet they also have the highest crime rates. We'll see who's right in the end, I suppose. Perhaps the changes in the outdated New York law have come in light of the surging gun violence throughout the state that I have linked and cited in the article. Please go and read that as well as listening to the podcast. And centering, of course, in the capital city. I'm thinking, of course, that because law-abiding citizens have, for at least the last century, been abiding the law, and even with that being the case, crime has only steadily increased, it may be time for another experiment. I don't know, say to actually abide by the Constitution, and instead of gambling on the U.S. government to protect us, we be trusted to protect ourselves. Because let's be honest, folks, the leftist agenda is not just, hey, let's get more government. It's saying to the government, we can't trust ourselves to make the right decisions. Daddy, please come help me. Help me make my own decisions in the privacy of my own home, and then tell me what I can do outside of my home. This, after all, was the entire point of ceding from the British Empire in the first place, which was clearly going to continue pinning us down under tyrannical rule. Please don't forget your history here, folks. I say let the games of citizen ownership begin. When it began in the 1700s, I think we did pretty well for ourselves. We have led the free world. So I think we should dig up our history and make sure we understand what we did it for and keep that at the forefront. But be careful. as we go forward into this new era for New York, because there will be a lot of statistics coming out of this next era for New York that will undoubtedly be, I'll say, skewing the facts as they have been in order to scare the bejesus out of every member of society so that they can do the whole "I told you so" thing and repeal this new landmark decision. But as you're listening to these statistics, be careful not to get lost in the fact that this new flurry of news, as it comes at you, keep in mind that they also swept a glaring hate crime under the rug by a deranged man who was clearly not legally in possession of his weapon when just 3 months ago he enacted carnage. Don't remember that one? I'll jog your memory. A 62-year-old black Pennsylvania resident named Frank James boarded a New York subway and fired more than 30 rounds into the crowd, making contact with 10 of those victims. And yet, instead of allowing the subway goers to arm themselves, New York's antique laws made them sitting ducks to Frank James's wrath. James spent years posting racist material on social media linked to black identity extremists, extremist ideologies. These would include the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army, BLM, and of course he was a frequent poster of the image of the black nationalist cop killer Micah Johnson. And instead of calling this what it is, which it's clearly racially motivated hate crime, New York insisted that it be called an act of terrorism. And that's what he's been charged on.
Frank James faced a judge for the first time today, and prosecutors say he is the one who shot 10 people during the morning rush in Sunset Park, Brooklyn on Tuesday, unleashing the type of attack the city has not seen in decades.
Prosecutors allege that Frank James had access to a stockpile of ammunition and other dangerous items in his storage unit. The judge ordered James to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He is charged with committing a terrorist attack on mass transit.
Even with that being said, though, Frank's attack was just one of nearly 10,000 crimes committed just so far this year in a crime wave that's being hailed as historical in New York's lineage. The crime wave has drawn so much attention that it's the inspiration for a new plan rolled out just this week in an attempt to focus on the homelessness and violence in the subways and other areas of high crime. Those are linked in the article as well. ABC News did an in-depth article on the, I guess, suspected motivations, we'll say, for why more guns are being carried by citizens and the relationship that has to the, the increase in gang violence and the decrease in police involvement. And that's also linked in the article. And much of this is policy driven, since in the wake of a spike in killings at the hands of police, people have gone from voicing concerns to all out rioting in the streets in order to pressure change in the courts and in police department policy and things like that. For the next few episodes, I'll be sticking with the theme of gun-related stories in the news. So on the next edition of Legally Insane News, I'll be talking about former Minneapolis police officer Kim Potter and her role in killing a known violent criminal named Daunte Wright. I'll be discussing the riots and the sentencing, the response from the community and the families, and I'll also be talking about the wave of recent settlement payouts in the tens of millions of dollars in just the last few years in Minneapolis. And I'll also be talking about why it's about race in the street, but justice in the court. That's it for this edition of Legally Insane News. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell for updates and extras on this and other stories. If you're listening to this podcast at legallyinsanefilms.com or the Small Town Justice page, be sure to also download the Spreaker app, where you can directly subscribe and help me bump up my download totals. If you like this episode of Legally Insane News, consider becoming a supporting member. For just $3, you can get access to members-only unreleased articles and podcasts, case files on our latest investigations, updates for events and conventions that we're attending, and discounts on swag. To do that, just head over to patreon.com/legallyinsanefilms. There are 3 different memberships, each with more content than the one before. This is where I release all of my documentary films with outtakes and extras, as well as another podcast called Small Town Justice. You can check those out by going to legallyinsanefilms.com and clicking Join the Fan Club. Send any questions, comments, feedback, and show ideas to thejusticepod@gmail.com. This has been a production of Legally Insane Films, LLC. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time.